we see those things begin to emerge with Attica, which is to say Athens. The land of Athens was so poor that no one really wanted it. And so the earliest inhabitants never had to flee anybody. Nobody wanted their land. But because of all the motions, stasis all over the rest of what is now called Hellas, the greatest men of those roving groups that were just simply fleeing all end up in Athens. And so the population of Athens swells so much that they're able to send out people and establish colonies. In other words, Athens becomes a kind of empire. And what Thucydides is telling us is that what is now called Hellas seems to owe its greatness to the initial emergence of Athens. And again, what characterizes Athens of all the rest of what is now called Hellas or Greece is that it was not affected by the motions, the stasis. In other words, while all the rest of the peoples that were simply roving the earliest times of Greece, Athens was not subject to that. And amid the fact that it was at rest, not in motion, not in stasis, what emerges is peace, wealth, and right and justice for them as a people. And so, according to the earliest times, what Thucydides is telling us is that while everything is in motion, flux, unstable, fundamentally lacking greatness, the possibility for founding a people as a people emerges for Thucydides with the example of Athens. And we can phrase that alternatively as follows. If it is the case that all is in motion, there is a fundamental flux and instability, chance, that characterizes the life of man, and particularly the life of man in political community, then the possibility of wise statesmanship under such conditions emerges in these rare pockets that lack motion and therefore allow for the possibility of greatness, which for Thucydides, at least based on this paragraph, would seem to be characterized by large numbers of people, walls, commerce, agriculture. And so you see the pattern here. This is techne, art, what we think of as technology. And what Thucydides is telling us is that Athens is a textbook example of how this kind of greatness can come into being. And regarding that greatness, again, to emphasize, characterized by techne, the arts, and that's to say, the mind of man, under such conditions of fundamental flux, fundamental motion, fundamental chance, Athens serves as an example, as the example, according to Thucydides here, of that kind of greatness. And one last thing to add about that second paragraph, because remember, again, I've done an entire recording just on that paragraph and everything that comes tumbling out of it on my Athens Corner website. But suffice it to say here that Thucydides is talking about, as he explicitly says, the earliest times. And what do we know is most characteristic of the earliest times? It's the divine, the gods. The reason we say that the old is the good is because the oldest of all the old is the gods. And so you see that Thucydides is going to have nothing to do with that, as a matter of principle, apparently. And this is going to distinguish Thucydides again from Plato and Aristotle, because in Plato and Aristotle, what you always have is that the fundamental principle of all politics is that the old is the good, precisely because the old is where the divine is to be found. Now, they, of course, have their own teachings about the divine and can in no way be said to be orthodox whatsoever. Nonetheless, they still treat the divine very prudently. And Thucydides, while he does have a teaching on prudence, it's very different than from what we find in Plato and Aristotle. Again, we see that Thucydides shows himself as an alternative, a fundamental alternative to the other defining legacies in the Western tradition, namely Plato and Aristotle. And keep in mind, our theme here is technology and nihilism. And so the status of the divine in relationship to techne, or the art, or man applying his mind, is everything. And here we are, just in the second paragraph of this text, and all of that has come tumbling out already. And Thucydides is even going to begin the next paragraph by emphasizing a justification of what he had just said was his argument. He says the following: a strong indication of the weakness of ancient peoples is this. Okay, again, full stop. Remember that in the previous paragraph, his argument was that there was no Hellas, there was no Greece. There were just small groups of roving peoples characterized by what they were lacking, namely any kind of greatness that comes from techne, art, what we think of as technology. And what he's explicitly saying now is that was weakness. Those were merely, as he says, ancient peoples. You couldn't call them Greeks because he's saying that Greece didn't even exist. And so what we're on the precipice here of discovering is what constitutes Greekness as opposed from barbarism. Because if the ancient peoples weren't even Greeks, what would they have had to have been? Barbarians. And whereas the barbarians are characterized by fundamental weakness, the Greeks, according to Thucydides, are going to fundamentally be characterized by a kind of strength. And we should have every anticipation that strength is going to come fundamentally from the power of mind to correct or redress all those weaknesses